Oh, hi everybody. It's me, Mr. Barth. I'm floating through space right now. I heard about the new social distancing guidelines, and I wanted to make sure I was social distancing a lot. So I'm here in the International Space Station all by myself. And here I'm going to talk to you about Chapter 27, Uncivil Wars. So as I'm going through this PowerPoint, you should be watching this video, pausing when you have questions or are writing things down. And if you have a question, you can always email it to me. Okay, here we go. Chapter 27. So you can find this PowerPoint on Google Classroom. Chapter 27 is all about the conflicts going on in America and outside the country in the 1960s and early 1970s. One weird thing I should mention about this PowerPoint is that it has dinosaurs on it. So last year when I was making this PowerPoint, I was making it during study hall, and some of the students were helping me find templates for the PowerPoint, and they saw this dinosaur one, and they thought it was really funny, and I made a PowerPoint with dinosaurs on it. So that's what that is. Don't get distracted by the dinosaurs. Okay, chapter 27. Here's our essential question. Remember, as we're going through this video, if I'm going too fast, pause the video. You can rewind the video to hear me talk about something again. You should be taking notes while I'm going through the video. I know some students like to take the notes on their own and then watch the video. Others do it the opposite way. Whatever works for you is fine. But here's an essential question. We're going to talk about liberalism and then conflict at home and the conflict over what's going on in Vietnam. So I'll move my video here. We talked a little bit about Kennedy before, and basically all we need to know for this chapter is that Kennedy's presidency would end in 1963 when he was assassinated, and Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president. So there's a whole bunch in there that we talked about in previous chapters that we don't really need to know for this chapter. Now, when Kennedy is assassinated, Johnson is sworn in, and he wants to idealize Kennedy after his death. There's Kennedy, or there is President Johnson being sworn in on Air Force One alongside Jackie Kennedy. And Johnson's plan for the country, his domestic policy, is called the Great Society. Basically, Johnson's plan is to, you can see in the second bullet point there, find abundance and liberty for all. What he saw was one of the biggest problems in America at the end of the 1950s was high rates of poverty. About 1/5 of all Americans lived in poverty, and racial injustice. And he believed these two different ideas were affecting many Americans negatively, and then they needed to be changed. And so he got Congress to pass the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which was his war on poverty. He was going to try to end poverty in America. And so he did things like they created Head Start. Head Start is a program for preschoolers from families who could not afford to go to a private school. Now, anyone can go to a preschool, whether they have money or not. Job Corps was a program for young people to train for employment positions in big cities. And Vista also offered different urban and rural maintenance and working in those areas to beautify cities and local towns. Now, Johnson was able to fight for civil rights where Kennedy would not be able to. He had more power in Congress than Kennedy did, even though he knew that Southern Democrats would be upset. In 1964, when he runs for president, he'll run against Barry Goldwater. Goldwater is very conservative. He's anti-communist, and he's very anti-federal government. He doesn't like the federal government getting involved in what he believes are state issues. So he was against the Civil Rights Act, that gave equal rights to African Americans in public and private areas, or public areas, because he thought it was overreach from the federal government. But Johnson would win in a landslide victory, and a big part of that was he was able to make people afraid of what would happen if Barry Goldwater became president. He used this commercial, this advertisement, that tried to show that if Goldwater was elected, it could lead to nuclear war. So I'll let you pause my video so you can watch that one on your own. Excuse me. There's a lot of different parts of the Great Society that I want you to know about. I want you to know that the federal government is going to spend money on schools that it never did before. Elementary and high schools are now getting money from the government. Colleges are getting money. But the other things I want you to know are about healthcare and immigration. Medicare is a program that's going to give health plan for people who are elderly, people who are retired. And Medicaid is health plan for people who are poor, who don't have a job, and thus don't have employment health insurance. There's some other things that are part of the Great Society here too that you can know about. I'm going to skip those ahead and go down to Immigration Act of 1965. This is going to make it easier for immigrants to move into the United States, and it's going to end the quota system. Remember, the quota system said that only a certain amount of people from some countries can come to the United States. This gets rid of those quotas. This graph here shows poverty rate in the United States from 1959 to 2006. You can see at the end of the 1950s, the rates of poverty is very high. Over 20% of Americans are impoverished. And it does go down in the 1964 to 1968 range when Johnson was president, but still it is above 10% between then and now. In the 1950s and 60s, women are increasing their opportunities in the workforce. In 1963, Congress passes the Equal Pay Act, which establishes the idea that that men and women should be paid equally for equal work. However, in many different industries, the idea of a gender wage gap is still prevalent, and it's still prevalent today in 2020. However, more women are working outside the home than ever before. In this graph here, you can see the amount of women in the workforce. In the beginning, in the mid-1960s, it's about 31-ish%. By the end of the decade, it's about 35, 36%. One of the issues that came up in the 1960s in many different women's rights groups was the idea of a double day. The double day is the idea that women work outside the home during the day, and then when they get home, they're expected by society and their husbands to take care of the house, take care of the kids, take care of dinner. So they're not only working at home during the day, but they're also working at night. That work never stops for women. This is an idea that was championed by Betty Friedan, and she discussed it in her book, The Feminine Mystique, which is very important. You should write down. And she advocated that women need more education. They need to work outside the home, and they should be able to seek out what makes them feel fulfilled, what makes them happy. But women are going through major changes in the 1960s. Women are having fewer children due to the availability of the birth control pill. Divorce is becoming easier in the 1960s, and women make up about 42% of college populations. Before Kennedy is assassinated, he tries to find out more about job and education discrimination for women. And so in the Civil Rights Act in 1964, that would pass after he is assassinated, they would include gender as a protected category against discrimination. One of the most famous pro-women's rights movements forms in the 1960s called the National Organization of Women that would fight for equal rights for women. It's important to know now the group, National Organization of Women, and feminism does not seek to replace men, does not seek to tear down men. It just seeks to find equal responsibility, equal participation, equal opportunities for women as well as men. Okay, I'm going to get a drink of water. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back, everybody. Still in space. I just saw a cool spot as I was flying over, and I wanted to look at it. Anyway, back to the Vietnam War. Okay, so let's talk about the Vietnam War, how it begins. The last time we talked, France had left Vietnam, and France, along with other countries, have come up with an agreement called the Geneva Accords, which said that North Vietnam is communist, South Vietnam is anti-communist, and that after 2 years they would vote to see which country would be. But we ended the last time talking about Vietnam with the leader of South Vietnam named No Dinh Diem taking over the country, canceling the election, and basically saying we are not going to have the election and South Vietnam is going to remain anti-communist no matter what. So America is supporting South Vietnam because they're anti-communist, but there's a big problem. South Vietnam, while it's controlled by the anti-communists, is facing a lot of rebels who are communist trying to take the country over. So North Vietnam is communist, and South Vietnam is trying to fight off these communist rebels who are fighting there in South Vietnam. Now, before he died, Kennedy was asked by South Vietnamese rebels if they could kill their leader, No Dinh Diem. Kennedy said they would not get in their way, and they were hoping that if Diem was killed, that somebody else who was anti-communist but not mean, like Diem was, would take his place. And we talked about that. We watched that video with the conflict between No Dinh Diem and the monks. Remember the monk who burned himself. Now, Johnson promised that he would not lose Vietnam to communism. And in June 1964, a naval ship was floating around North Vietnam when they reported that a North Vietnamese boat had attacked their ship. The USS Maddox was a naval ship that said a torpedo was launched, and luckily it missed our ship. Now, later on, after analysis, it was determined that the attack was not real, that it was a radar guy who misread what was happening, and that the American ship was never attacked. So that wasn't found out until later. Before that happened, before they found out that it wasn't real, Johnson would ask Congress to fight back against North Vietnam, and Congress gave him the ability to fight in Vietnam through something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This basically said he could fight in Vietnam however he wanted, and Johnson is hoping that a quick bombing and attack of North Vietnam would end the war quickly, so that he would be able to keep doing the Great Society, because he knew a long war would probably end the Great Society. All the money he's using to fight poverty would not be able to be used for that purpose. It would have to go to the war effort. By early 1965, Johnson is escalating the war by deploying American soldiers to Vietnam. They're doing extensive and intensive bombing of North Vietnam. One of the largest bombing raids was Operation Rolling Thunder, where they would have this massive bombing campaign. Overall, it would last over 3 years. But it really didn't affect how North Vietnam was able to fight in the war. In fact, it even hardened the will of North Vietnamese to fight. So North Vietnam is where most of the North Vietnamese communist soldiers live. However, many communist guerrilla soldiers, known as the Viet Cong, would go down into the south to fight against the United States while they were there. You can see there's a picture of a Viet Cong soldier. Usually they don't have very many supplies. They're not a traditional soldier. They fight in what are called guerrilla tactics, which means they're hiding in the trees, they're ambushing, they use booby traps, and American soldiers are going to fight against the Viet Cong for most of the war. America's not going to invade North Vietnam. We're not going to go and fight the traditional soldiers. The fear is if we did that, that China would enter the war like they did in Korea. So you can see this is a graph showing the amount of soldiers in Vietnam during Kennedy's administration. It's very low numbers. There's a few thousand military advisors that went and talked and helped the anti-communist soldiers. But then after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, it skyrockets to over 500,000 soldiers by 1967. You can see here are some videos of the bombing raids over North Vietnam. You can watch those on your PowerPoint as long as you want. Now, in 1965, most of the country supported the war. They called it a living room war because for the first time, someone who was living at home could see all the carnage and fighting and death on the nightly news. You know, if you go back to previous wars, the Revolutionary War, you would never see, as a person on the home front, you would never see the war unless the battles took place in your backyard. The Civil War was the first time there were pictures, but all the pictures were taken days after the battle happened. In World War I, there were some pictures and videos of the actual battle. It really wasn't until World War II that video of battles would be taped, but they would rarely be shown. At least they would be shown in a propagandized way to the people. In the Vietnam War, you have NBC and CBS correspondents going out along with soldiers, and there's not a lot of censorship going on. So basically, they can show whatever they want. And nightly news is showing all these things going on, and people really get a firsthand view of what it's like to be in a war. In 1965 and 1966 especially, journalists began writing about negative stories in Vietnam. And one of the tactics that was used in the 1960s to find Vietnam Viet Cong soldiers was search and destroy, where they'd go to a village that they thought was connected to the Viet Cong in some way, in some cases destroy villages. And on the nightly news, they might show that villages are being destroyed and people don't like America, but Johnson was talking about how everything was going great. This led to what's called a credibility gap. It made people feel like Johnson was hiding bad news about the war's progress. There's a gap between what Johnson is telling us about what's going on in the war and what people are able to see for their own eyes on the nightly news. And the war is getting really expensive. We're running into the billions of dollars, and it keeps on climbing. In 1965, there are some anti-war movements, but they're pretty small. Most are made up of students, clergy, and civil rights activists. A famous event was in 1965 when 15,000 people would march to the White House to denounce the war because they thought that working with South Vietnam was unrealistic, that there was no way they would remain anti-communist. And they thought it was a civil war and it's not our responsibility to go and police the rest of the world. And as time would go on, more and more students would begin to support the anti-war movement. Now, earlier, before the war started in 1960, students formed a new group called Students for a Democratic Society, where they talked about some of the ideas of like the beat movement, disillusionment with consumer culture, the gap between the rich and the poor. And the thing I want you to write down here on the end is they formed a free speech movement. See, in the 1950s and earlier, students did not have the right to speak about politically controversial subjects. In fact, in the 1960s at UC Berkeley, administrators would ban student political activity on university grounds. And students would go and perform sit-ins. You can see here where they took over the administrative building to try to gain their basically their right to speak about politically controversial issues. Here's some movements of the SDS giving speeches about the war and about other issues. And increasingly over time, students become more and more against the war in Vietnam, especially in 1967 when Congress passes or agrees to reopening the selective service system. It would draft young men for military service. In 1967, they had been drafting for a while, and they got rid of the automatic student deferments. So in 1964 and 65 and 66, if you were a college student, you would automatically not have to go into the war. However, in 1967, they changed it by saying things like you could only get out of the draft if you were a student in college and getting good grades. If you were a student in college and weren't getting good grades, you would not be deferred. But you could be deferred if you're a conscientious objector. Some students would leave the country, like flee to Canada. In some cases, they would intentionally fail their health or mental screenings. There's things students would do to, like I know one student, he took a speaker and basically blasted music in his ear so that he would fail the hearing test that day, and he did fail. Sometimes students would burn their draft cards. Here in the bottom of the slide, you can see a picture of students taking their draft cards and burning them as a display of anti-war protest. Some conservative students would also organize, but they did not have as big of impact. The biggest conservative student movement was the Young Americans for Freedom, and they supported the war in Vietnam. And just in general, in the 1960s, many students and young people are revolting against authority, revolting against middle-class values. You've probably heard of hippies before. There's a picture of some hippies. Basically, they want to go against the predictability of their parents and the consumerist nature of the 1950s. And they embrace new music like the Beatles, Rolling Stones, The Who, and The Doors. And they use a lot of recreational drugs like marijuana and LSD. Okay. You've probably heard of Woodstock before, 1969, a famous hippie concert where thousands showed up. Okay, Days of Rage. Now, remember before I said Johnson hoped that the war would end quickly, but it did not happen. South Vietnam was not able to fight against the communist Viet Cong without America's help. And that was especially seen in 1968. In 1968, at the beginning of the year, Vietnam was celebrating their New Year holiday celebration called Tet. It's like a week-long celebration, and basically one of the things they do is they celebrate the people who died in the previous year. And so both sides, the communist and anti-communist, said we're going to have a truce during this week-long celebration to remember those people who died. And so during this time period, Viet Cong have been planning for a while now a massive assault to basically sneak up on all the anti-communists in South Vietnam and attack all at the same time. So they did. They snuck in thousands of soldiers and thousands of guns and ammunition into South Vietnam, all under cover of darkness. And then during this time period of truce, they attacked more than 100 cities, including the capital of Saigon. Now, the battle was very difficult. It was actually a battlefield victory for the United States. Communist forces lost a lot of soldiers, and many people in the communist leadership thought this could have ended the war for them. However, at home, when people saw what was going on, they saw all this fighting on the nightly news, and they said, well, wait a minute. Johnson keeps saying the war is almost over, but this attack seems like the government is lying, that the communists might win, that the communists are not close to surrendering. How can the war almost be over if the Viet Cong is carrying out such a huge attack? You can see here is um, what they did. The North Vietnamese would cross over in what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they'd go down into Laos and Cambodia, where American soldiers were not located, and then quickly cross over the border into South Vietnam and attack American bases and cities. So in 1968, many people begin to turn against the war. Here, I'm going to take a drink of water in space where there's no gravity. I think you can do that in space. I'm not sure. Anyway, I think there'd be bubbles flying through the space, but I caught them all. So, okay. Many people began to turn against the war. These people are known as doves, and supporters of the war became known as hawks. Now, many anti-war Democrats did not like Johnson. They wanted to get rid of him. And so Johnson said in March 31st, the anniversary is coming up this week, that Johnson would not run for re-election. And a few days later, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated while visiting Memphis, Tennessee. And riots erupt around the country. One of those anti-war Democrats, Robert Kennedy, was running for president against the eventual Republican nominee. He tried to say, follow King's nonviolent example, don't go into these riots. And about a month or two later, Robert Kennedy, JFK's little brother, would also be assassinated. Here you can see pictures of Martin Luther King Jr. on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel and his friends pointing at where the gunshots came from. And then here's a picture of Robert Kennedy, who was walking through a hotel kitchen, being helped up by a young cook, I believe. Now, in 1968, both King and Kennedy were against the Vietnam War before they were assassinated. Many Americans are upset at Johnson. They're upset at the Democratic Party. They're upset about the Tet Offensive. And in 1968, the Democratic National Convention, where they're voting for who would be the Democratic nominee, is a place where thousands of protesters came to Chicago. And there in the streets of Chicago, police officers fought with protesters with tear gas and clubs. Media showed inside or outside the convention center, all the protests in the streets. There was lots of fighting and yelling inside the convention. And eventually, the Democratic Party nominated then Vice President Hubert Humphrey from Minnesota for the presidency. And he endorsed continuing to fight in Vietnam, while also trying to find a peace. Behind the scenes, he really did not support the war that much, but he felt like this was something the Democratic Party was already behind and he needed to do it. Here you can see some of the fighting between the police officers and protesters outside in Chicago. In 1968, Alabama Governor George Wallace also runs as a third-party candidate, and he's fighting for segregation. In that same election, Republicans nominate Richard Nixon, who we talked about before. He also ran in 1960. In 1968, he's going to use something called the Southern Strategy, where he promises to support civil rights, but go easy on actually enforcing it, which means basically in words, he's going to say, yeah, I support laws that help civil rights, but he's not actually going to practice it. He's not actually going to enforce civil rights on Southern states. And that's going to get a lot of support for white Southerners. He campaigns against the war. and he helps to, and this is going to help him win the election. In during this time period as well, there's lots of conflict racially in the United States. There's different groups like the Chicano Moratorium Committee protesting against the war. The Black Panther Party, we talked about in our last chapter, spoke out against the war. The famous boxer Muhammad Ali was drafted, but he refused to serve. He was sentenced to prison. In the 1960s, we talked about how women are seeking out more rights. This is led by young, college-educated women. And many found that the civil rights movements of African Americans and anti-war protests against Vietnam were not interested in women's rights issues. And so they decided to start their own groups. We talked about now other groups would also start during this time. And so the idea of sexism and how society treats women was brought to the forefront of our national conversation. One of the most famous events was when there was a Miss America pageant, and many women came and brought animals, like you can see in the picture here, and they dressed up animals. They were trying to make the symbolism that women are being treated and judged as animals. Black and Latina women were also working in civil rights movements for African Americans and Hispanics in the United States. However, they also found that these groups did not really seek out women's rights either. One of the most famous laws that you should write down is Title IX. On your slide, it looks like Title IX. That's Roman numerals for 9. This is seeking out anti-discrimination laws in educational facilities. So in schools, they have to give similar funding for male and female sports programs. They cannot discriminate based on your gender, what classes you take. Like if you went to the 1950s, a girl might not go to a metal or woods class. A boy would not be able to go to a sewing class or face class. Now with Title IX, you can't do stuff like that in schools. In the 1950s and 60s, gay liberation, gay and lesbian activists also fought for equality. We had already talked about in the 1950s, many gay and lesbian activists tried to portray themselves as following with the stereotypical suburban family as possible. However, in the 1960s, gay rights activists became increasingly demanding of more rights. One of the most famous examples of fighting for more rights was in 1969 at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. In the 1960s, it became commonplace for gay bars and nightclubs to be raided by police officers and harassing customers. And so in 1969, after a raid, its patrons would riot in the streets of New York City for 2 days, and it led to the building actually being lit on fire. Now, while these riots were rare, they were celebrated in the gay liberation movement, and it sparked off other organizations to start, like the National Gay Task Force, which began lobbying for more rights in Congress. And here you can see some pictures as I take a drink in space. Now, in 1969, when Nixon becomes president, he's going to launch a new plan for Vietnam. It's called Vietnamization, where he withdraws U.S. troops, and they say, "Okay, South Vietnam, you're going to fight against the communists now. We're going to get slowly out of the war, and you take over more responsibility." There is more anti-war movement at home. Americans want us to be done with the war. And as this is all happening, Nixon secretly orders bombing of supply routes on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And there in the map, you can see where the Ho Chi Minh Trail is. It's in Laos and Cambodia, two countries we are not fighting in. We start bombing in these countries. Eventually, eventually people find out. Students are outraged that Nixon would expand a war when he said he was going to end it. And so students all over the country began to rally and protest against this bombing in Cambodia. One of the most famous examples of this is at Kent State University. And there's a huge crowd of soldiers that were eventually told to leave, stop protesting by National Guardsmen. At the rally, National Guardsmen would fire into the crowd of unarmed students and would kill 4 students. And this is actually the 50th anniversary. 2020 is the 50th anniversary of the Kent State University killings. There you can see tear gas being shot at students. And this is the famous picture that was put on newspapers all around the world. This girl yelling about this other student that was killed. And by 1968, you can see that's the peak of how many soldiers are in Vietnam. And then it starts to decline with Vietnamization when Nixon becomes president. Now, in 1968, before Nixon was president, there was another event that was not known about in America yet. In 1968, a group of U.S. soldiers went to this small village called My Lai, where there's mostly women and children. The soldiers who went there got intelligence that there was a bunch of communists that were there, and eventually through different events, they ended up killing hundreds of South Vietnamese civilians. We don't exactly know how many people were killed. Some estimates say it was around 200. Some estimates say it was closer to 500 or 600 people were killed. And all this happened, and the military tried to cover it up until it was released by the media in 1969. Only one soldier would be convicted of war crimes, and he would eventually be released by President Nixon. And so this led to even more anti-war protests. A new group called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War led a protest. They got a bunch of combat medals while they were serving in the war. Here is a picture of some veterans throwing their combat medals at the U.S. Capitol, protesting the war. And then there's some pictures of the dead at My Lai. Now, Nixon wants to gain peace in Vietnam. And so he tries to make deals behind the scenes with Russia and China to lessen the possibility of going to war with those countries as well. He wants what's called a détente. It's there in the second bullet point, and it's important. It means you lessen tensions. So they do things like they create a treaty called SALT I. SALT I is a treaty where we say, okay, U.S. and Russia, we're going to stop with the arms race, which is huge, that countries are going to stop trying to make more and more bombs and nuclear weapons. In 1972, Nixon visits China for the first time, and he wants to have better relations with China, have like ping pong tournaments and stuff. But in 1972, as America is trying to negotiate with North Vietnam. Nixon wants to make sure the North Vietnamese know we're serious, so he intensifies bombing runs against the country, North Vietnam. However, they're still getting supplies from China and Russia. So the United States, led by the National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, is going to negotiate with the communists in Paris. And so they eventually come up to a peace. They say, okay, America is going to leave South Vietnam as long as North Vietnam promises to let South Vietnam go, as long as they promise not to invade South Vietnam. And Nixon's hoping that as soon as we leave, we'll start sending money and supplies to South Vietnamese, and they'll be able to stick around and stay around. But in 1975, North Vietnam would go against their promise, and they would attack South Vietnam, they'd attack Saigon, and they take over the whole country. So even though we are gone, even though we promised South Vietnamese we would help them, we left, and the communists take over the whole country. After everything, 58,000 Americans are killed, 300,000 Americans are wounded, and it costs the United States over $150 billion. Now, as the 1970s are continuing on, there you can see that the title is "The Silent Majority Speaks Out." People who were against a lot of the changes in the 1960s will win a lot of early victories. Now, the Warren Court is the Supreme Court at the time of the 1960s. They're going to find that, or they're going to expand civil rights and civil liberties in the country. The most famous court case you should know here is Miranda versus Arizona, which gives people who are arrested what are called Miranda rights. The police have to inform you of your rights, like you have the right to remain silent. They got rid of religious rituals in public schools, trying to separate church and state. So, like, you cannot pray in a public school, or a teacher cannot lead a prayer in a public school. And one of the things that courts wanted to do in the 1960s was desegregate schools, but there's a huge resistance to this. There are many schools around the country that are still segregated, even though Brown versus Board of Education happened in 1954. So one of the methods that they would do to desegregate schools was by busing students. So one of the ideas was, okay, because of different factors, there are, in a suburb, there are majority white students, and in this inner city of this metropolitan area is majority black. And so what they would do is they would bus students from both areas to the other school. And that way there'd be more diversity within the schools, and there'd be less segregated. However, it's not very effective in the North. There's a large resistance against this. Milliken versus Bradley required any busing plans to happen within the boundaries of a single school district. So a suburb and a city can no longer mix with each other now, which we talked about in the 1950s. Suburbs, through a lot of different means, excluded African Americans. And so with that, that meant suburbs remained mostly white. And here's a famous picture, the soiling of Old Glory, the protests of busing. This is actually happening in Boston. So in 1972, many Democrats abandoned their party. Nixon is going to get a lot of support from segregationists. Nixon proclaimed that he was able to end the war in Vietnam, and he wins in a landslide. You can see here he wins all but a few electoral college votes. He wins 96% electoral college votes. And that's where we're going to end there. So, okay, it's me again, back in space. Here I am. That's all I have for chapter 27 right now. If you have any questions, please email me, or you can join my Zoom meeting every day from 12:30 or 2:30. You can find the link. I'll post that every day on Google Classroom. But I think that's all I got from you. If you have any questions, just let me know. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you back on Earth eventually. Hopefully, maybe. Thank you. Bye.